each side mistrusting the other to the point where they really don't have confidence.
Well, the two sides can reach a compromise. The question is whether they will reach a compromise.
If they move first, the other side is going to reciprocate.
The visit for the United States is a two-edged sword. There's pluses and minuses.
As the China-North Korea relationship improves, that North Korea might become essentially more confident in slowing down the denuclearization process.
Do you think opening up this office is a breach of the UN and US sanctions?
Enhancing routine communication between North and South is a good thing for the peace process.
Providing some reassurances that the Republic of Korea will not get too far ahead of the process.
From the Voice of America, this is Washington Talk.
Hello, thank you for joining us for this week's edition of Washington Talk. This is Connie Kim filling in for Jung Cho. Today on Washington Talk, what will the U.S. and North Korea need to discuss when the negotiations restart? President Trump asked Secretary Pompeo to cancel his planned trip to North Korea because he felt that there had not been enough progress in the denuclearization talks. Meanwhile, Secretary Pompeo introduced a new U.S. Special Representative to North Korea. How will the U.S. be able to move toward its goal of a final, fully verified denuclearized North Korea?
Taken off the sanctions. We have massive sanctions. I want to take them off quickly, but we got to get rid of them.
To help us better assess the current situation, we're joined in the studio by Frank Jannuzi, a former advisor to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and current president of the Mansfield Foundation. And Ambassador James Zumwalt, a former deputy assistant in the Bureau of East Asia Affairs focusing on Japan and Korea, and former ambassador to Senegal. He is the current CEO of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, USA. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning.
Welcome to the studio. While announcing the now canceled trip to North Korea, Secretary Pompeo introduced Stephen Biegun, the new U.S. Special Representative to North Korea. How do you think this is going to help the U.S. with the discussions?
Well, it should. The Secretary of State cannot be the case officer who manages an intricate, detailed process like this on a daily basis. He's got too many other things that he has to worry about. So the naming of Steve Biegun, a very seasoned, experienced Republican national security specialist with a long history working in the Congress, in the House and the Senate, with the Majority Leader Bill Frist, and also working under Condi Rice in the Bush White House during the early years of the Bush administration. I think he's going to really bring the kind of daily organization to the engagement process that has long been missing because, simply said, Pompeo has too much in his day to manage this process on a daily basis.
This is going to be a very tricky negotiation because the North Koreans have long been demanding an official end to the Korean War, while Washington says denuclearization must come first. Do you think that the two sides can reach a compromise on this issue?
Well, the two sides can reach a compromise. The question is whether they will reach a compromise. But clearly, the sort of compromise you could envision is some sort of coordinated actions where North Korea and the United States each take steps either simultaneously or near simultaneously, so the other side can see some progress. So that's certainly possible, but whether in fact both sides will agree to that kind of an approach or not remains to be seen.
That's the tricky box we're in, is the one of mistrust. Each side mistrusting the other to the point where they really don't have confidence that if they move first, the other side is going to reciprocate. And that's why I think the kind of simultaneity that Ambassador Zumwalt is describing is what's going to be required. But I think the U.S. side has another more fundamental concern, which is that once they declare the end of the war, I think the United States worries that the North Koreans may then turn around and say, well, this is great. Now that we're not enemies anymore, our nuclear weapons program is no longer a threat to you. And so we can revisit the whole question of denuclearization. So I think the U.S. side is deeply nervous about normalizing relations with a nuclear-armed North Korean state.
Right. And that's why the U.S. continues to put pressure and continues to impose sanctions. And President Trump this week, he imposed sanctions on Russian shipping companies and vessels trading with North Korea to speed up the denuclearization process. And this seems to be a change from his previous stance where he was opposed to using the term maximum pressure. Is this a change in the administration's position from before?
I don't know that this is going to do anything to speed up the process. I mean, I think it's about punishing nations and companies that are violating UN sanctions. So if the sanctions are going to be credible, occasionally you have to pull the trigger on enforcement mechanisms. So the administration is frustrated by Chinese and Russian and other cheating on the sanctions. They're even concerned about South Korean infringements of the sanctions. So they're trying to restore some credibility to the sanctions regime.
I would argue that I think the U.S. attempts to use U.S. laws to enforce sanctions might have a deterrent effect. It's impossible to measure, but for a Chinese company or a Russian company, or for that matter, a Singaporean company, they have to decide, is it worth the risk to engage in this transaction with North Korea that you might become a target of a U.S. sanction? So there may be some deterrent effect, but I would agree with Frank that the sanctions regime is not as strong as it was before President Trump's visit to Singapore. And I think the U.S. is trying to remedy that by taking these kinds of steps to shore up the international sanctions regime.
And shifting gears to Chinese President Xi Jinping, there are speculations that he's going to visit North Korea next month for its 70th anniversary of North Korea's foundation. What kind of impact do you think President Xi's visit to North Korea will have on the current negotiations?
What do you think, Jim? I mean, I can't decide if this is a good thing or a bad thing.
Well, China has a very important role to play in this process. And so obviously, this is not something that can be negotiated just between the United States and North Korea. There's a lot of other players involved, and so China will be involved. And the United States and China share a common interest in seeing denuclearization of the peninsula. So in that sense, you could see some positive aspects. However, there is a risk for the United States in that China and the United States do not share a vision about the future of the U.S. alliance structure in the region. And from China's perspective, if the U.S.-ROK alliance is weakened as a result of this process, that would be a good outcome for China and a bad outcome for the United States. Really, I would say his visit for the United States is a two-edged sword. There's pluses and minuses.
I agree. I think it is mixed. And Trump in the past has expressed some concern that after a visit between Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un, the North Koreans seem to harden their position a little bit. And so I think there's a worry in Washington that as the China-North Korea relationship improves, that North Korea might become essentially more confident in slowing down the denuclearization process. I'm not sure that's a fair reading of China's role, but I know that there are many people in Washington who are worried about that.
Definitely. There are still a lot of concerns that cozying ties between Pyongyang and Beijing are going to slow down the denuclearization process.
The irony is that as long as China-North Korea relations are poor, how does North Korea have the confidence to denuclearize? So if the relationship with China improves somewhat, and the North Koreans feel more confident that the Chinese will defend them against extreme pressure or maximum pressure, then ironically that might make the North Koreans more willing to take serious steps on denuclearization.
And North Korea, they're preparing for a huge military parade marking its anniversary next month to show its military strength. Do you think North Korea is sending out conflicting signals while claiming that they're pursuing peace, but on the other hand, parading missiles and tanks down Pyongyang?
Well, North Korea has a weak negotiating hand, and so they have to use every technique they can designed to maximize the benefits they might achieve in an international negotiation. One technique they have is to try and divide the various players, China, United States, South Korea, Japan, and deal individually And so one of the challenges for the United States will be to coordinate our policies, particularly with our allies, Republic of Korea and Japan, but also with China. So obviously from North Korea's perspective, they have to try and reduce that possibility. And one way of doing this, obviously, is demonstrating that we have things, we can change our policy if you don't show us some kindness or some love in this process. So I think this is just part of the negotiation, not surprising in my view, and something we need to deal with.
So I want to take a look at National Security Advisor John Bolton's comments. He said that the two Koreas agreed to North Korea's denuclearization within 1 year. Is Bolton trying to pressure Seoul to do more, or is he asking South Korea to keep its promise of North Korea's denuclearization?
I think Bolton is simply trying to say again to Seoul and to Pyongyang, the patience of the United States is not infinite. And at some point, President Trump and the U.S. government are going to lose patience with a North Korean state that is not taking meaningful steps toward denuclearization. That's the message.
I think it's important also to look at what the new Special Envoy Steve Biegun said yesterday in his press conference. And he essentially said negotiations with North Korea are going to be tough. But President Trump has created an opening, and now my job is to explore that opening and see whether we can make progress. And I think that's a pretty fair assessment of where most people are. There's a lot of skepticism. No one thinks it's going to be easy, but there may be an opportunity, and it's important for us to see whether we can develop that opportunity into some real progress to have denuclearization, peace, and prosperity on the Korean Peninsula.
We'll have to see whether that 1 year timeline will be kept by North Korea. Thank you so much for the insights. I'd now like to talk about the contrast between Washington and Seoul. Do the US and South Korea have different priorities for these negotiations?
앞으로 상호 대표부로 발전하게 될 남북공동연락사무소도 사상 최초로 설치하게 되었습니다.
An inter-Korean liaison office at the Kaesong Industrial Park will be opening this month. South Korea says this office does not clash with existing sanctions. The U.S. emphasizes that improving inter-Korean relations must be in lockstep with progress on eliminating North Korea's nuclear arsenal. So there are speculations that South Korea sent in sanctioned materials to this liaison office. Do you think opening up this office is a breach of the UN and U.S. sanctions?
Well, from a technical standpoint, it might be, but I really think it's sort of irrelevant. I think that the key point is that enhancing routine communication between North and South is a good thing for the peace process. And so opening up a Kaesong liaison offices, I think, should be encouraged and not discouraged. Any technical violation of the sanctions involved with this office would have no impact on North Korea's overall security situation.
But Ambassador Zumwalt, don't you think this is a little too early to be opening this office when there haven't been really progress on the denuclearization front?
Yeah, I think there's a larger issue here. Setting aside opening the office in Kaesong, the fundamental issue is going forward, will the United States and Republic of Korea continue to work in tandem with coordinated policies designed to engage, but at the same time apply pressure on North Korea. And it's too early to say whether this is a step that will lead to a divergence in our policies. But the real issue, I think, is the Republic of Korea needs to continue talking with the United States, explaining what it's doing, and providing some reassurances that the Republic of Korea will not get too far ahead of the process by providing economic inducements that undermine the sanctions regime and make it harder for the United States to negotiate on denuclearization. So coordination really is the key here.
I strongly agree with that point. There has to be coordination. What I find a little troubling is the idea that we have to be in lockstep. I think it's not quite lockstep. I think it's more like when you're walking side by side, maybe holding hands, but one person might be in front or the other person might be behind at different times. There's going to be some differences in the pace with which the U.S. and South Korea engage the North, and that's okay as long as we're coordinating, as long as we're talking, and as long as one person's not getting too far out in front. We need to keep them in sight because if the South Koreans make too much progress and speed on North-South relations, especially economically, that's going to undercut the leverage that the U.S. needs on the security talks.
But Ambassador, do you have any concerns that South Korea could create loopholes in the North Korean sanctions in pursuit of inter-Korean cooperation?
Well, that is the concern, and that's why I was stating that how important it is for South Korea to engage closely with its partners. I mean, the United States, obviously, but also I would encourage South Korea to engage with Japan and China as well, because ultimately it's going to be a multilateral regime of sanctions that will lead or convince North Korea to pursue a different path. And so while I agree with Frank that inter-Korean relations are important and maybe seeing South Korea take the lead, maybe walking slightly ahead of the others is appropriate, but maybe hand-holding distance and no further might be the way to go. So the point I was making was as Korea is making decisions about its engagement with the North, coordinating closely with the United States and others and making sure that there's comfort on the part of the United States so we don't have the appearance that there are fissures between us is very important.
Right. So there has been close coordination between South Korea and the United States. There were cases where the U.S. provided sanctions waivers to South Korea. For example, the restoration of the military communications lines. To what extent do you think the inter-Korean cooperation should be exempt from sanctions then?
Well, I think that process was important because what it said was that Korea, recognizing that a step it wanted to take might be seen as a technical violation of sanctions, went in and got permission because there was a decision that the good created by this military line was outweighed whatever economic benefit North Korea might get. And so I would encourage South Korea to continue that process rather than just pursuing on its own economic engagement, to come to the international community and talk about its strategy, what it's trying to do, and requesting waivers when appropriate. That would be the way to make sure that there isn't a distrust or disagreements emerging between Seoul and the rest of the world.
No, I agree. There's a big difference between lifting sanctions and case-by-case waiver of sanctions. And the case-by-case waiver is entirely appropriate. The sanctions regime exists not to be an end in and of itself, but to support the diplomatic process. So as necessary, the parties can consult on waivers. They can selectively waive items that need to be waived, but they should maintain the structure until we see really significant, irreversible steps by the North to denuclearize.
Well, we'll definitely have to see what kind of impact opening up this liaison office will have on the nuclear front. So before we go, let's take a look at the photo of the week on North Korea. Today we have a photo of Kim Jong-un visiting a cow farm. However, reports indicate that this farm is no ordinary farm. It reportedly breeds cows strictly for the North Korean senior officials. The food these cows are fed are far more expensive than the food that the average North Koreans eat. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, the North Korean society is not egalitarian, right? It's stratified, as is our own society. And so beef is a luxury good in North Korea for sure. So any beef is not going to grace the menu, I think, for most North Koreans. And you take a look at Kim Jong-un, you can see that he's enjoying the good life and has been for quite some time.
Ambassador?
It looks like he's been eating his share of beef, shall we say. But the other point I think that is interesting is we're seeing more and more photographs of Kim Jong-un visiting economic facilities as opposed to inspecting military facilities. So if there's a goal to develop the North Korean economy, that's a good thing. And so in some ways, I'm encouraged by this picture.
To me, it was surprising because the cow farms were so clean.
It does looks like an aircraft hangar.
Well, Ambassador Zumwalt and Mr. Jannuzi, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's all for today's Washington Talk, and from all of us here at Voice of America, thank you for watching. This has been Connie Kim.